The grand hall buzzed with an electric tension, the air thick with anticipation. Humanity had finally achieved what many thought impossible: first contact with an advanced alien civilization. The Arathians, a race of towering, elegant beings with shimmering blue skin and intricate armor, stood at the forefront of galactic power. Their technology was centuries ahead of Earth's, their culture steeped in tradition and pride. For Commander Elias Voss, this moment was both a triumph and a test. Elias stood tall among his fellow humans, his uniform immaculate despite the exhaustion etched into his face. Years of war and diplomacy had hardened him, but today felt different. Today wasn't about survival. It was about proving humanity belonged in the stars alongside these otherworldly beings. As he scanned the room, his gaze landed on her, Princess Lirael de Vinara, the youngest daughter of the Arathian High Sovereign. She was breathtaking, clad in golden armor that seemed to glow faintly under the artificial lights. Her piercing violet eyes radiated disdain as she surveyed the human delegation. Lirael's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "So," she began, her tone dripping with mockery, "these are the creatures you call intelligent life. They look more like frightened children playing dress-up." Her words echoed across the chamber, drawing stifled laughter from some of the Arathian nobles. Humans shifted uncomfortably, their faces reddening with anger or shame. Elias clenched his jaw, but said nothing. He'd faced worse insults during his time as a soldier. What stung wasn't just her arrogance, it was the truth buried beneath it. Compared to the Arathians, humanity was young, inexperienced, and outmatched. But they were also resilient, resourceful, and determined. That fire burned within Elias, even if he couldn't put it into words right now. "Do they even understand us?" Lirael continued, tilting her head as though studying an insect. "Or should we simplify our language for them?" More laughter rippled through the crowd, though quieter this time. Some of the older Arathians exchanged uneasy glances. They knew provoking humans could backfire. But Lirael didn't care. To her, this was entertainment, a chance to assert dominance over a weaker species. One of the human diplomats stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Your Highness," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "we've come here seeking peace and cooperation." "Surely." "Peace," Lirael interrupted, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "You think you deserve peace. You can barely manage your own planet without destroying yourselves. Why would we waste our time helping such primitives?" The room fell silent. Even the Arathians who had chuckled earlier seemed uneasy now. Elias took a deep breath, his hands tightening into fists behind his back. He wanted to respond, to defend his people, but he knew better. This wasn't the battlefield. Words wouldn't win this fight. Not yet. Instead, he locked eyes with Lirael, refusing to look away. There was no fear in his gaze, only quiet resolve. It unnerved her. For all her bravado, she hadn't expected someone like him, a mere human, to meet her gaze so boldly. The brief connection lingered longer than either intended before she turned away, dismissively waving a hand. "Enough of this farce," she muttered, turning to leave. Her entourage followed obediently, leaving the humans standing awkwardly in her wake. As the doors closed behind her, Elias exhaled slowly. His comrades whispered angrily around him, but he remained silent. Something about Lirael's words, and the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, stayed with him. Little did he know, this encounter was only the beginning. The diplomatic cruiser hummed softly as it drifted through the vast expanse of space, carrying its fragile cargo of hope and mistrust. Commander Elias Voss stood by the viewport, gazing out at the endless stars. Despite the calm exterior of the ship, tension crackled in the air like static electricity. Humanity's delegation was on edge, wary of their Arathian counterparts, while the Arathians seemed equally dismissive. Among them, Princess Lirael de Vinara remained a constant presence, aloof, critical, and unapologetically disdainful. Elias had tried to avoid her since their disastrous first meeting, but fate seemed determined to keep throwing them together. She lingered near the edges of conversations, her sharp violet eyes watching everything with detached curiosity. Occasionally, she would offer cutting remarks about human customs or technology, drawing smirks from her attendants. Each barb grated against Elias's patience, though he refused to rise to the bait. It was during one such exchange that chaos erupted. An alarm blared suddenly, shattering the uneasy quiet of the ship. Red lights flashed across the corridors as the crew scrambled to respond. "We're under attack," someone shouted. Through the viewport, Elias saw streaks of energy fire erupting in the distance, rogue fighters swarming the cruiser like predators closing in on prey. Before anyone could react, an explosion rocked the vessel, sending everyone stumbling. Smoke filled the air as panels sparked and debris tumbled from the ceiling. Amid the confusion, Elias spotted Luriel being pulled aside by two members of her personal guard. Her expression shifted from surprise to alarm as they whispered urgently into her ear. Whatever they said clearly unnerved her. She glanced toward the humans with a mix of fear and suspicion. Then, without warning, her guards abandoned her. Elias watched in disbelief as the pair sprinted away, leaving Luriel standing alone in the corridor. For a moment, she froze, her golden armor gleaming dimly in the flickering light. When another blast shook the ship, she stumbled forward, clutching at the wall for support. Her earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by raw panic. "Princess," Elias called out instinctively, rushing toward her. He didn't know why. He should have focused on his own people, but something about her vulnerability stopped him in his tracks. "What are you doing?" she snapped, though her voice wavered. "Leave me." "No time for arguments," Elias replied tersely, grabbing her arm. "If we don't move, we're dead." Without waiting for her response, he dragged her toward the nearest emergency pod bay. Behind them, the sound of collapsing bulkheads grew louder, punctuated by shouts and screams. They barely made it inside before the cruiser took another direct hit. The impact sent them sprawling, the force slamming the hatch shut behind them. As the pod ejected into the void, Elias caught a final glimpse of the damaged ship spiraling out of control before it disappeared into the darkness. When the shaking subsided, Elias turned to check on Luriel. She sat hunched over, her breathing ragged, her once immaculate armor scratched and dented. Her gaze met his, filled with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "You saved me," she muttered, her tone laced with disbelief. "Why?" Elias shrugged, leaning back against the wall. "Because letting you die wouldn't solve anything. Besides, I'm not giving you the satisfaction of dying today." Her lips parted as if to retort, but no words came. Instead, she looked away, staring out at the desolate moon they were hurtling toward. For the first time, Elias saw cracks in her polished facade. Beneath the arrogance and pride lay someone who, like him, was afraid of what came next. Neither of them knew it yet, but this crash landing would change everything, for both of them, and perhaps for their worlds. The pod slammed into the surface of the barren moon with a jarring thud, sending dust and rocks spiraling into the air. Inside, Elias groaned as he pushed himself up from the floor, his body aching from the impact. Across from him, Princess Luriel sat slumped against the wall, her golden armor dulled by scratches and scorch marks. Her violet eyes darted around wildly, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "Are you hurt?" Elias asked, his tone clipped but not unkind. Luriel ignored him, instead focusing on the cracked viewport outside. The landscape was bleak. Endless dunes of gray sand stretched in every direction under a pale alien sky. A cold wind howled faintly in the distance, carrying with it the promise of freezing temperatures once night fell. "We need to get moving," Elias said, grabbing a survival kit from beneath his seat. "This place isn't survivable without shelter." "I don't take orders from you," Luriel shot back, though her voice lacked its usual venom. She shifted uncomfortably, wincing as one of her armored plates emitted a faint crackle of energy. Something was wrong with her suit. It pulsed erratically, draining power faster than it should. Elias noticed immediately. "Your armor's malfunctioning. If we don't fix it soon, you'll freeze out there." "It doesn't concern you," she snapped, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. But even as she spoke, her teeth began to chatter slightly. The temperature inside the pod was already dropping. Ignoring her protests, Elias rummaged through the survival kit until he found a small toolkit. He knelt beside her, inspecting the intricate designs etched into her armor. Up close, he could see tiny fractures spiderwebbing across its surface, likely caused by the crash. Whatever technology powered the suit was failing rapidly. "What are you doing?" Lirael demanded, pulling away instinctively. "Don't touch me." "If I don't do something, you'll die," Elias replied firmly. "And trust me, I'd rather not explain to your father why I let his precious princess turn into an ice sculpture." Her glare could have melted steel, but she didn't resist further. Carefully, Elias worked at dismantling parts of her armor, not to harm her, but to conserve what little power remained. With each piece he removed, Lirael flinched, clutching at the exposed sections of her shimmering blue skin. For all her bravado, she looked fragile now, stripped of the layers that defined her status and identity. When he reached the chest plate, Elias hesitated. Beneath it lay a glowing emblem embedded directly into her skin, a neural interface connecting her to the armor. It flickered weakly, then went dark. In an instant, Lirael gasped, her hands flying to her throat as if trying to speak. But no words came out. Her wide eyes locked onto Elias, panic overtaking her features. You've silenced me," she managed to mouth, her lips trembling. "No," Elias said quickly, holding up his hands. "It wasn't me. It's the suit. That interface controls more than just your armor. Without it, you can't communicate verbally." He paused, studying her expression. "But you're still alive. That's what matters." Lirael stared at him, her anger simmering beneath the surface. For the first time in her life, she was truly powerless, unable to command, unable to mock, unable to hide behind the facade of superiority her armor provided. All she could do was sit there, vulnerable and exposed, while the man she despised tried to keep her alive. Outside, the wind grew louder, biting at the edges of their fragile sanctuary. Elias glanced toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning its descent. Night would fall soon, bringing with it unbearable cold. They needed to find shelter, and fast. He turned back to Lirael, who glared at him silently, her pride wounded but not broken. "Listen," he said, his voice softer this time. "I know you hate me, but if we don't work together, neither of us is making it off this moon alive." For a long moment, Lirael simply stared at him, her violet eyes filled with conflicting emotions. Finally, she gave a curt nod, signaling reluctant agreement. Though she couldn't speak, her message was clear. Fine. But this isn't over. As they prepared to leave the wreckage behind, Elias realized something important. Beneath the armor and arrogance, Lirael Divinara was just another being trying to survive. And maybe, just maybe, they had more in common than either cared to admit. The desert moon was unforgiving, its harsh winds whipping stinging grains of sand against their faces as Elias and Lirael trudged across the endless gray dunes. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving them shrouded in darkness, lit only by the faint glow of distant stars. Temperatures plummeted rapidly, biting at their skin, despite the layers Elias had salvaged from the pod. Lirael walked stiffly beside him, her bare arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her golden armor now hung loosely around her torso, stripped down to conserve energy. Though she still couldn't speak, her body language spoke volumes. Her clenched jaw, her narrowed eyes, the way she flinched whenever Elias glanced her way. She hated relying on him, but she had no choice. Elias adjusted the makeshift blanket draped over his shoulders, tugging it tighter against the cold. He'd fashioned it from insulation panels found in the wreckage. sharing what little warmth he could with Luriel. But even with the added protection, her shivers were becoming more pronounced. "We need to keep moving," Elias said, breaking the silence. His voice sounded strange in the vast emptiness, swallowed almost immediately by the howling wind. "If we don't find shelter soon." He didn't finish the sentence, but Luriel understood. She nodded curtly, her movements mechanical as they pressed forward. As they walked, Elias began talking, not to fill the silence, but because he sensed she needed something to focus on other than the biting cold. At first, his words were practical. Reminders to watch their footing, warnings about patches of loose sand. But gradually, he shifted to stories. Stories about Earth, humanity's struggles, and the resilience that defined his species. "I grew up in a city called Chicago," he said, his tone softer now. "It wasn't perfect. We had our share of problems. But there was this lake nearby. Lake Michigan. On clear days, you could see for miles, and the water looked like glass." He smiled faintly at the memory. People always said it reminded them of hope. Like no matter how bad things got, the lake stayed calm. Luriel glanced at him sidelong, her brow furrowed, her lips parted as if trying to respond. But frustration flickered across her face when no sound came out. Instead, she gestured toward him, motioning for him to continue. Elias chuckled dryly. "You're curious. That's new." He paused, then went on. "Earth isn't like your world. We don't have advanced tech or glowing cities. For centuries, we fought each other over land, resources, beliefs. But through all that chaos, we learned one thing. Survival doesn't come from power. It comes from working together." Luriel stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Her violet eyes searched his face, studying him as though seeing him for the first time. Slowly, she reached out and tapped her chest twice, then pointed to him. It was a clumsy attempt at communication, but Elias understood. "You think I'm brave?" he asked, surprised. "No, I'm just doing what needs to be done. Survival isn't bravery, it's necessity." She shook her head firmly, tapping her chest again before pointing to him once more. This time, her expression softened slightly, a flicker of respect, or maybe gratitude, breaking through her usual arrogance. Before Elias could respond, the ground beneath them shifted suddenly. A low rumble echoed through the air as a hidden crevice opened up mere feet away. Instinctively, Elias grabbed Luriel's arm, pulling her back from the edge. They stumbled backward together, landing hard on the sand. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, breathless and wide-eyed. Then, without warning, Luriel began laughing, silently, her shoulders shaking as tears streamed down her cheeks. It was an odd sight, both heartbreaking and beautiful, and Elias couldn't help but smile. "Guess we make quite the team," he muttered, helping her to her feet. Though neither said it aloud, something had changed between them. In the freezing darkness of that alien moon, two very different beings had begun to understand each other, not through words, but through shared struggle. And in that understanding lay the seeds of something greater: trust. The morning light revealed a desolate landscape, the gray sands stretching endlessly under a pale orange sky. Elias and Luriel had survived the freezing night, huddled together beneath scraps of insulation in a shallow cave they'd found carved into the side of a dune. Exhaustion clung to them like a second skin, but there was no time to rest. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, the distant hum of engines reached their ears. Elias froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the utility knife strapped to his belt. "They found us," he whispered, scanning the horizon. Sure enough, 3 sleek drones appeared on the edge of the desert, their metallic bodies glinting ominously in the sunlight. They moved with precision, scanning the terrain methodically. It wouldn't take long for them to locate the cave. Luriel's violet eyes widened with panic as she pointed frantically at the drones. Though she couldn't speak, her fear was unmistakable. She gestured wildly toward the wreckage of their pod, clearly suggesting they double back and try to salvage more supplies. But Elias shook his head firmly. "We can't go back," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Those things are hunting us. If we stay here or head back, we're dead." Her frustration bubbled over as she stomped her foot and pointed again, this time jabbing a finger at him accusingly. "You got me into this," her expression seemed to say. "I didn't ask you to come with me," Elias shot back, though his tone lacked real anger. "Look, I know you're scared, but we need to move. Now." Before she could argue further, one of the drones turned sharply, its sensors locking onto their position. A high-pitched whine filled the air as it unleashed a burst of energy, narrowly missing them as they scrambled out of the cave. Sand exploded where they'd been standing moments before. "Run," Elias shouted, grabbing her wrist and pulling her forward. They sprinted across the open dunes, the drones closing in relentlessly. Each step felt heavier than the last, their legs burning from exhaustion and the relentless pull of the sandy terrain. Behind them, the drones unleashed another volley of attacks, forcing them to zigzag erratically to avoid being hit. Luriel stumbled suddenly, falling to her knees. Elias spun around, yanking her upright just as a blast scorched the ground inches from her feet. Her wide eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, he saw genuine terror, not the haughty defiance she usually wore like armor, but raw, unfiltered fear. "We keep moving," Elias said firmly, dragging her along. "I won't let you die here." The chase continued for what felt like hours, the drones growing closer with every passing minute. Just when it seemed hopeless, Elias spotted something ahead, a jagged ridge of rocks jutting out of the sand. If they could reach it, they might have a chance to hide. "Over there," he yelled, pointing toward the ridge. With renewed determination, they pushed themselves harder, their lungs burning as they climbed up the steep slope. Reaching the top, Elias quickly scanned the area below. The rocky formation created natural alcoves and tunnels, perfect cover if they could make it inside. But the drones weren't far behind. One of them hovered directly above them, its weapons charging for another attack. Thinking fast, Elias grabbed a piece of debris lying nearby, a twisted shard of metal from their pod, and hurled it with all his strength. The makeshift projectile struck the drone squarely, sending it spiraling to the ground in a shower of sparks. Luriel stared at him in astonishment, her expression softening slightly. For once, there was no mockery in her gaze, only gratitude. "Come on," Elias urged, pulling her toward the nearest tunnel entrance. Once inside, they pressed themselves against the cool stone walls, listening as the remaining drones circled overhead. Their mechanical whirring grew fainter until finally, silence fell. For a moment, they simply stood there, catching their breath. Then, slowly, Luriel raised a trembling hand and placed it gently on Elias's arm. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A silent acknowledgement that for now, they were allies. And in that fragile moment, something shifted between them. The princess who had mocked him and the soldier who had saved her were no longer enemies. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The rocky tunnels offered temporary sanctuary, but Elias knew it wouldn't last. The rogue drones would eventually find them. And when they did, there'd be no escape. They needed a plan, and fast. As he leaned against the cold stone wall, catching his breath, he glanced at Luriel. Her golden armor was battered beyond repair, its once pristine surface now dull and cracked. She sat slumped on the ground, her violet eyes fixed on the entrance to the tunnel, watching for any sign of movement outside. "We can't stay here," Elias said finally, breaking the silence. "If we don't act soon, those drones will corner us." Luriel nodded, though her expression was grim. Despite her inability to speak, she had begun communicating more effectively through gestures and expressions. Now she pointed toward her chest, then mimicked pressing buttons on an invisible interface. It took Elias a moment to understand what she meant. "You want to fix your armor?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Even if we could, There's no power source left. She shook her head firmly, tapping her chest again before pointing to a faint glow emanating from the edge of her armor near her shoulder. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Elias realized what she was trying to say. Some residual energy still lingered within the suit. It just needed to be redirected. "All right," he muttered, kneeling beside her, "but I'll need your help. Show me how this works." For the first time since their ordeal began, Lirel hesitated. Her pride warred with necessity. Allowing him to touch her armor felt like admitting weakness. But survival outweighed ego. Slowly, she extended her arm, guiding his hands to specific points on the intricate design etched into the metal. Together, they worked in tense silence, her trembling fingers correcting his movements when he made mistakes. After several tense minutes, the armor hummed softly, its systems flickering back to life. Though far from fully operational, it responded to Lirel's commands once again. A small console projected holographic controls into the air, glowing faintly in the dim light of the tunnel. She tapped rapidly at the interface, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you doing?" Elias asked cautiously. Lirel turned to him, her violet eyes blazing with determination. Without speaking, she gestured for him to follow her deeper into the tunnels. He obeyed, trusting her instincts, or perhaps simply having no other choice. They moved quickly, navigating narrow passages until they reached a cavern overlooking a cluster of structures in the distance. It was a communications array, abandoned but intact. Elias's heart raced. "That's our ticket out of here. If we can send a signal, reinforcements will come." But as they approached the facility, the sound of engines roared above them. The remaining drones had found their trail. Lirel stopped abruptly, turning to face Elias. Her expression was unreadable, but her body language conveyed urgency. She pushed him toward the array, then pointed to herself before drawing an imaginary line across her throat, a clear message. "No," Elias said firmly, shaking his head. "I'm not leaving you behind." She rolled her eyes, shoving him harder this time. When he refused to budge, she grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to meet her gaze. Her silent plea was undeniable. This is my chance to make things right. Reluctantly, Elias stepped back, clutching the makeshift transmitter he'd salvaged earlier. "Fine," he growled. "But if you die out there, I swear I'll never forgive you." Lirel smirked faintly, giving him a mock salute before sprinting toward the drones. Using her partially repaired armor, she unleashed bursts of energy, creating a dazzling distraction that drew the machines away from the array. Explosions lit up the sky as she lured them into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Meanwhile, Elias worked frantically to activate the transmitter. His hands trembled as he connected wires and adjusted frequencies, all while keeping one eye on Lirel's fight. Each detonation echoed like thunder, sending shockwaves through the ground beneath him. Finally, the device crackled to life, broadcasting their location and proof of the rogue faction's betrayal to the wider galaxy. As the transmission succeeded, reinforcements arrived in the form of Arathian starships. The drones were obliterated in seconds, their wreckage scattering across the desert. But when Elias turned to look for Lirel, his stomach dropped. She lay crumpled on the sand, her armor shattered and smoking, her breathing shallow. Rushing to her side, he knelt down, brushing hair from her face. For the first time, there was no mockery in her eyes, only gratitude and quiet acceptance. "You idiot," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why did you do that?" Her lips curved into a faint smile as she reached up weakly, placing a hand over his. Though she couldn't speak, her message was clear. The journey back to the Arathian homeworld was a blur of healing chambers, diplomatic meetings, and whispered conversations. Lirel lay unconscious for days, her body battered but alive thanks to advanced medical technology. Elias stayed by her side as much as he could, ignoring the disapproving glares of some Arathian nobles who still saw him as an outsider. He didn't care about their opinions anymore. What mattered was that she survived, and so did the fragile hope they had fought for. When Luriel finally opened her eyes, it was in a room filled with soft light and the hum of machinery monitoring her recovery. Her violet gaze found Elias almost immediately, and though her voice was weak, her words were clear. "You stayed," she murmured, her tone tinged with disbelief. "Of course I stayed," Elias replied, leaning forward slightly. "You saved us both out there. Least I could do was return the favor." A flicker of a smile crossed her lips before fading into something more serious. "I wasn't wrong about you humans," she admitted softly. "But I also wasn't right. You're not primitives. You're survivors. And maybe we have more to learn from each other than I thought." Her admission struck Elias deeply. This was the same woman who had mocked humanity mere days ago, dismissing them as unworthy of respect. Yet here she was, acknowledging not only their strengths but her own misconceptions. It was a monumental shift, one that gave him hope for what might come next. Days later, the Grand Assembly Hall buzzed once again, but this time the atmosphere was different. The rogue faction responsible for framing humanity had been exposed, its leaders arrested and brought to justice. Representatives from both species gathered beneath the soaring arches of the chamber, united in purpose rather than divided by fear. Luriel stood at the center of the stage, her golden armor repaired but bearing visible scars, a testament to all she had endured. Beside her stood Elias, his uniform bearing patches and burns earned during their ordeal. As she addressed the crowd, her voice carried a weight it hadn't before, not arrogance, but humility. "When I first met Commander Voss," she began, her gaze sweeping over the audience, "I saw only differences between our peoples. I judged humanity based on assumptions, blind to the courage and resilience that define them." She paused, turning to look directly at Elias. "What I failed to see was that survival isn't just about power or technology. It's about trust, cooperation, and sacrifice. These are lessons I learned the hard way, and I am better for it." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her. Even the most skeptical Arathians seemed moved by her words. When she finished speaking, applause rippled through the chamber, growing louder until it echoed like thunder. Afterward, as delegates mingled and shared cautious smiles, Elias approached Luriel. "That was quite the speech," he said, crossing his arms with a smirk. "Think anyone noticed you left out the part where you nearly got us killed?" She laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Some things are better left unsaid." Then, after a moment, her expression softened. "Thank you, Elias, for everything." He nodded, meeting her gaze steadily. "Anytime, Your Highness. Just don't make me rescue you again anytime soon." As they parted ways, the bond they had forged remained, an unspoken promise to bridge the gap between their worlds. Outside the assembly hall, two flags fluttered side by side in the breeze, one representing the Arathian Empire, the other bearing Earth's insignia. Together, they symbolized a new chapter, a future built not on fear or mistrust, but on mutual understanding and shared dreams. For Elias and Luriel, the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but as they looked toward the stars, they knew one thing for certain: together, anything was possible.